this video, I want to once again deal with the situation where we have a survey where a person has given multiple answers, and I want to count the number of correct answers. In this case, I want to account for aliases. In this first row, the person has answered NF, and in the second and fourth row, the person has answered Nathan Feuerstein, and I want both of those to be correct. I want to solve this using a list of lists, where each item inside of my list, that is the outer list, is then the individual correct answer, and then the inner list is the different ways you can spell it. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to only have one example, where there are two aliases, but you could have more. I also have the simple scenario where I have one delimiter, because that's not the focus of the video. I first want to split this answer into a list, where each answer is then an item inside of a list. This will be used in the next step, where I want to iterate over each individual answer one at a time. This is done using the text split function, which conveniently takes a text and a delimiter, in this case a comma, and then splits that into a list. This next bit involves multiple functions that I have to chain together, and it will be difficult to follow, but I hope it makes sense. I first want to add a column, which will be my outermost context, which we can mostly ignore because it simply means I'm iterating over each row of my table, which also means when I refer to column 1, I refer to the intersection, so the current value in that column. I want to transform this list of answers, where I want to evaluate each individual item and say, can I find this inside of my list of list corrects? But I then have to iterate over this list because I might have multiple correct answers, and then I have to compare the current answer to each of the current correct answers' aliases. So multiple contexts. But I'll start with the outermost context, which is then this list that I want to transform. This list is then inside of the custom column, and again, because this actually takes place in an add column context, that means custom refers to this individual row, and the next time it's this row. The transform is a function, which means I can pass in a variable name. I could also use the underscore, but it will make more sense because I'll need another function later. I'll call this variable answer because it's the individual answers found within my multiple answers, found within my list of multiple answers. I now have access to the current answer, which I want to compare to the list of list corrects, which I want to do using list accumulate. So my function is to take the answer and compare that relative to list accumulate. I want to iterate over list of list correct. My seed, that is what is my starting value, that is the answer variable, which I can then access using the answer keyword. My function is then state, current, because this is what you get when you Google list accumulate, so I'm going to keep up the tradition. My function is then that right now I'm inside of this inner context, which is the individual rows of the list of list correct, but I then have to access the inner list. And because of the way I've structured my solution, I can use the function list.matchesAny. If this function evaluates to true, then I want to do something. And matchesAny then takes a list, which is what we have inside of list correct, which is why I want to say that that's my current keyword, because that is the current item in my iteration of list correct. And my condition is then another function where I want to create the variable correct answer, because this is then the individual correct answers inside of the current row inside of list correct. So it's quite a mouthful, but my comparison is simple. I simply want to know if the correct answer is equal to the state, which is the answer variable, which is the current item inside of the outer list. And this list.matchesAny will then generate a list where it can then be true or false. So is NF equal to NF? That's true. Is NF equal to Nathan Feuerstein? That's false. That means I have a list of a true and a false, which means there's at least one correct answer, which means this function evaluates to true, which means this if evaluates to true, which means I then want to output a 1. And if not, I want to output the state. And I don't want to output a 0 or something else, because I might have multiple correct answers inside of my list correct. And if this condition wasn't met and I wrote 0 instead here, then I would have the B turn into a 0, and then I can compare that to the next correct answer. So I have to output the original value. And then I need to be mindful of my parentheses, and we'll see if I wrote everything correct. In this case, NF is equal to NF, which is one of the correct aliases. So this first row outputs a 1, and the next rows are not equal to NF or Nathan Feuerstein, so they output the original value. In the second row, I have a B and a 1, and in the fourth row, I have someone who does a little trolling, and they actually wrote the same answer, but in the two aliases. I'm not going to deal with that possibility, where a person gives the same answer twice, because I think the likelihood of that is too low, but that's something you can play with yourself. The only thing I still have to do is to sum up this list, but if I try to do that, that's going to fail, at least for some of my rows. Because right now I have a list that contains different values, both numericals and not numericals, and I can't sum up a B. But in my last row, where my list is 1 and 1, I can sum it. So I first need to do another transformation, so any value that isn't a 1 becomes a 0. You could have a person who gives an answer of 1, and that will then be counted, so that would be a bit of cheating. I'm going to assume that question you ask won't have an answer of 1. Otherwise, you'd need to account for that. I want to transform my list. My list is then in the custom 1 column, and I want to say that my current, which is my variable, so the current item of my list, that should go towards. If the value is then equal to a 1, then I want to output a 1. Otherwise, I want to output a 0. And I need to put that in parentheses to mark it as a variable. So this still outputs a list, but now I have a list only of numericals, which I can then sum. And I could do all of this in one column, but in order to make it easier to follow along, I'll use multiple columns. And that was actually it. The real trick was to use List.MatchesAny, because list accumulate lets you loop through a list, but then you have to actually do something with this inner list. And List.MatchesAny does exactly what I need, compares one value to a list of multiple values, and then, does a comparison, which is what I specify here. So